start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's Develop event, How to Manage Up Effectively. There's a quite often repeated phrase, which is people don't necessarily quit a job, they quit a boss, but always foisting the blame onto bad bosses when things go wrong is a bit an oversimplification. So managing and being managed is a two-way street and a two-way conversation. There's obviously plenty of advice going around about how to manage down, but how to manage up is a lot more spotty. And so for this particular webinar, we are joined by alumnus Craig Smith, a culture change facilitator, who will provide us some practical tips and tricks on how to manage up effectively and how this helps you in progressing and tracking your own career. So without further ado, Craig, I'll hand on over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, Jeremy. So nice to be working with you all. I've got a few slides to share with you, and we're going to do a couple of polls as well in a second, just to find out a little bit more about you. But let me just quickly whiz through for the initial couple of slides that I've got. Yeah, as Jeremy alluded to, I am an alumni of Newcastle University myself. I won't tell you how long ago it was I graduated, but it was a fair time ago. I then went on to have a career to span a number of large organizations, some or many you'll have heard of, in the construction industry, water industry. Then I went into work for Royal Mail for a few years, and then the last corporate job I had, the last proper job I had, was with PepsiCo, which is, as you know, makes brown fizzy water, but it's also a food company. I worked at Walker's Crisps, which I'm sure is a brand you're all familiar with as well. I left there in 2007 and started my own business. I've actually got two businesses now. I know Jeremy said Flint Spark was the one that I'm kind of got that hat on today, but I've also got another business, Big Picture People, where we do corporate communications. I do a lot of training and development with organizations. I do coaching, facilitation as well to a certain extent. A lot of training though, and I train. One of the courses I actually deliver is for first time managers, and it's all helping them to get their head around what is can be a really challenging role when they step into management for the first time. But what I'm going to be talking about today, as Jeremy's already alluded to, and which is why you've signed up, why you're here today, is this whole challenge about managing our managers, or managing upwards, or influencing upwards, or kind of having those relationships with our managers. I guess people managers today have a fairly complicated life and complicated role. Not only do we have to manage traditional relationships, i.e. I use this, kind of just it sounds very hierarchical, and it's the last thing I'm into is this idea of those below us and those above us. But I guess just for today we need to have that sort of terminology consistency. Is the people we manage, our direct reports, the people we manage across, our peers, and also outside of the organization and outside of our department. Our customers, or clients, or whoever, the people we serve, we have to do a certain degree of management with them. And then there's this managing up. It's the people who are meant to be giving us direction and guidance, who sometimes we don't always get that from, or if we do, it's not always in the way that we need it. So what I was going to ask is just we'll run the first of our polls, if you can kind of put that on the screen for us. And I've just got three polls really just to get a flavour for the kind of the types of challenges that you've got, but also how urgent is your sense of urgency. So if we could just maybe stick the first poll on the screen, please. I can't see that, but there we go. So yeah, first one is, do you actually manage people yourself? Might sound like an odd question, but again, in the spirit of the of what we're looking at here, I think it's useful to kind of reflect on ourselves. We're talking about managing upwards, but then if we're managing downwards, then we need to think about, well, what do our direct reports do that influences us, and how do they manage us, because it's a useful frame of reference. Okay, so great. Looks like we've got a pretty good response there. If you want to stick the results on the screen. So it's pretty much, that brings back lots of horrible memories, 52-48 as a split. But yes, so yes, it's come out 50-50. Just slight majority of you are managing people yourself, and slight minority aren't. But I think that's useful to know. If we can maybe then go on to the second question, please. So again, I don't want to be presumptuous. You may be here because you've already got a fantastic relationship with your manager and you want to make it better, or you may have a relationship that's less sort of ideal. So and you want to kind of do something differently there. So again, we'll just give you a few minutes. I think we've got what, 79% of people who've responded so far. So if just the last few of you who've not voted yet, if you can kind of pop in your final responses. 89%, 3 more who's not voted yet. Okay, let's call that then. So let's just put those results on the screen. So that's good to know. So, you know, majority of you already got good relationships that you want to make better. Significant number of you have got excellent relationships, but for, you know, a number of you, you've just described it as okay, and then small majority, a small percentage of you have kind of said it's poor. Right, final question, and then we'll get on with the content. So if we can just move to the final poll then. I guess even if you've got a great relationship or an excellent relationship, and there should be, yeah, if you make sure you scroll all the way down there, you can vote on as many as you want here. So this is tick all that apply. So when it comes to your biggest frustrations of working with your manager, just use, I've given you a kind of a limited list there, which kind of partly came from the questions that you generated and some of the stuff I was going to talk about, but also we've got another at the end, if you want to pop that into the chat bar, and I'll have a look at those, and we'll have a look at those, maybe not now, but later on. So where are we at? So we've got 76% of you've responded. I know there's multiple options here, so some of you may be hovering over which ones you're going to vote on or which ones you're going to supply. So 83%. Just give it a couple more seconds just to see what other responses we've got. Okay, let's pop those results on the screen. So interesting. A lot of you have said inconsistent decision making, communication styles, common source of frustration, lack of contact time, lack of feedback. We've got a couple there with what I describe as bullying, toxic behavior. We've got a couple who've put comments in the chat, so I'll have a look at those later on. But interesting, gives us a flavour for some of the challenges. And as I said, we had a lot of questions that came in, and we'll look at those, or we'll have a look at some of those later on. But that's great. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for that. That's useful to know, and hopefully gives you a sense of whether some of the things you're facing at the moment are the same. So Jeremy stole my line there, but that's fine, because it is a commonly said thing. You've probably heard it before, that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. And from my experience, a lot of the challenges that we have in organizations, and we have the challenges we have working for our managers, comes around from this idea of the Peter principle. If you've never heard of the Peter principle before, it's that we tend to promote people to their highest level of incompetence. I don't mean that in a facetious way, but what tends to happen is, in a lot of organizations, is they will promote people based on their technical ability, not on their people ability. And as people managers, a significant part of your job should be managing people. That's often where a lot of these challenges come about, is that we've kind of promoted them because they're really technically brilliant, but actually a fundamental challenge or problem is that they're not particularly good at managing people. And that's because maybe they've never been shown how to do that, or they've been given the training or the support and coaching to do that. And I think one of the things that you know might be worth reflecting on is, and again, I try not to be too cheesy, but you know, kind of being the change you want to be. Sometimes I think with managers, we need to sort of show them the way that we want to be managed by them, by demonstrating that ourselves. So that's kind of some of the things I'm going to be talking about today will reflect that I think we need to in some cases sort of role model the role modeling that we're not getting from our managers, if that's a challenge. One of the things that I want to just sort of kind of flag up, this is my personal opinion early on, is that for you to manage upwards, in order for you to be able to influence successfully and change some of the things you're wanting to change with a manager, you need to be aware of your limits. Great book, if any of you are interested in it, Snakes in Suits. It's all about organizational psychopaths, which says that actually there are a very few number of people who work in organizations who are in leadership roles who demonstrate psychopathic tendencies, i.e. lack of empathy. I'm not talking about axe murderers, but lack of empathy, and real sort of not really very good kind of manner with their emotional intelligence. But they're in a very small minority, and we sometimes may label people as being toxic when actually it's just incompetence. You can work with a weak manager. You can someone who's indecisive, has poor judgment, is disorganized, poor time management, etc. You can do something to help them. You can support them, or at least you can find ways of managing that situation. I would argue in a relationship where it is bullying, autocratic, manipulative, micromanaging, that isn't so manageable. And in that sort of situation, you need to make some pretty tough decisions as to whether that's where you want to be in that relationship with that person in that organization, or in that organization, full stop. I know that's a fairly kind of austere choice, but I would say that the toxic behaviors like that are pretty unmanageable, because that person will be pretty resistant to any kind of influencing strategy that you adopt. So on that basis, I think you need to, if you're looking at managing a manager, and thankfully looking at the survey results or the polling that you gave us earlier, most of you do have relatively good relationships with your manager. This is a model by Stephen Covey, the circles of influence. You need to be aware of what you can actually influence and what you can control, and focus on that rather than the things that you can't control. And a toxic boss, a bullying manager, is not something you're going to be able to necessarily change or even influence. So you need to be aware of that. I'll put another framework up here, which I'm a really big fan of, which is the ladder of accountability. And we'll share these slides with you afterwards. And I've said to Jeremy that we'll get these to you. So if any of these models kind of resonate, you can kind of pore over them in a little bit more detail. But ladder of accountability is both, I think, for ourselves, but also for our bosses. And this is all about how we adopt accountable behaviors rather than unaccountable behaviors. It's very easy to be in denial or blame or make excuses or wait and hope that our boss is going to suddenly improve. But actually, to be accountable, we need to acknowledge that the reality is that relationship may not be what it wanted to be, or we want to improve it, to take a position on that, to try and find solutions, and then to take some responsibility for making that work. But again, within the realms of being clear about what you can control and what you can't. So just in terms of kind of reframing or framing your relationship with your boss, or your manager, I've just got a couple of sort of ideas to share with you, and then we're going to kind of pause to sort of have a look at some of the questions that you've generated before, and any questions you've got as a result of what I'm talking about here. I do a lot of training with managers to help them to have difficult conversations with not necessarily with their employees, but with anybody in their working life. And one of the frameworks I use there is to recognize that when we're trying to influence someone, so when we're trying to change something about someone we work with, whether it's our boss, a peer, or whether it's someone who works for us, what we're trying to do is change their behaviors. We're not trying to change them. It's not legitimate for us to try and change their personality, and secondly, it's pretty much impossible. But what we can change is their behaviors, because they are things that we can influence and change and make discrete, that aren't necessarily about changing their personality. And whenever we change our behaviors, we need to be aware of a couple of things. So in this model here, it's the ABC model, and then the B is the behavior itself. Upstream of the behavior that we're trying to deal with our manager, we've got antecedents, things that are causing that behavior, and it starts with antecedents. It could be also an anchor, as sometimes it's described as. So it's useful sometimes, I think, to think what's going on for our manager. They may be hurried, pressured, overly brief, not particularly great at communicating, but we need to look, how are they being managed? What's going on for them? And whilst we can't necessarily change or influence that, we need to be kind of empathetic to it as well and recognize that. Downstream of the behaviors that we're sort of thinking about or wanting to maybe focus on or change, we've got the consequences of those behaviors, which is the C in this framework. So any behavior has a consequence, it has an outcome, and understanding what that consequence is and whether that's the consequence that the manager is trying to get can sometimes help us to try and reframe the situation for them, or try and help them to recognize that maybe what they're doing isn't necessarily having the results that they wanted it to do. So the ABC model, I'm again, not got a lot of time to go into this, is just what I'm saying here is recognize that if your manager's displaying some behaviors, and as I say, I'm not talking about, you know, kind of bullying, horrible behaviors that are kind of, you know, bordering on kind of things that you probably need to be raising elsewhere. But if it's just mild forms of incompetence or time management or lack of clarity, there are things that you can work with, but you need to understand what's causing that lack of clarity. Is it something in their personal life or their professional life? And also, as a consequence, what are they getting from that? It might be that they're getting some short-term fixes that aren't necessarily right for you or right for other people within your team that you need to maybe bring to their attention. And I'll talk about a couple of ways that you can do that in a minute. Another way that I've found particularly helpful when it comes to deconstructing or helping managers to or approaching managers in the right way with the right frame of mind when we want them to change something. And again, this applies, all of the stuff I'm talking about here equally applies to anybody in your working relationships. It's not just your managers, but again, I've teased out the ones that I think are particularly relevant, is to think about the positive intent. And this kind of links to what I've just been talking about with the ABC model, which is that whatever they're doing, they're trying to get a result. They're trying to do something, hopefully with some positive intent. And even if the intent isn't necessarily always clear how, you know, what the positive element of it is, if you can assume that there's some positive intent there and try and work on that, it makes it a much easier way to address what it is that you want them to do differently in your working relationship, and then working on that. And another way of kind of thinking about that is that any weakness that a manager has, again, putting aside the kind of bullying sort of type behaviors, any weakness that a manager has is often a strength that's overplayed. So, for example, being laissez-faire and maybe not particularly directive and giving you clear instructions might be an indication that one of their strengths is actually that they trust you, or they want to, you know, they believe in you, or they're kind of happy that you know what you're doing. So it's how can you focus on maybe the positive side of what it is they're doing and not just jump into the sort of assuming the negative. I've put a QR code on there. Don't scan that now. Scan it and if you're interested in finding out more about this in the when you get the slides through, or when you watch the replay of the video. Really interesting video there of someone who kind of reframed the way she dealt with people and the way she carried herself, both as a boss and also as a human being, by assuming positive intent, or at least kind of trying to focus on positive intent and working with that. So if you're interested in that as a concept, maybe have a look at that. One of you, a few of you mentioned in the poll there, and also it came out in some of the questions that you'd raised about communication and personality differences. Again, could spend a whole session just talking about this. And some of you maybe already have done or are familiar with tools like Myers-Briggs or DISC or Insights, or many other different tools that you can use to understand your communication preferences and the communication preferences of others. The one I use a lot in my work is DISC. This is the DISC model, and what this looks at is two facets of kind of human behavior, which is our tendency to be kind of active, fast-paced, assertive and loud, which is the kind of the bit at the top of the screen here, versus are we kind of more quiet, are we more calm, are we more kind of thoughtful, less expressive perhaps. So in kind of layman's terms, we may say the difference between that is extroverted or introverted behaviors, very loud and outgoing versus more quiet and more calm and more kind of thoughtful. And then if you take each of those two dimensions and then split that into another two dimensions, which is is that person more people orientated or more task orientated? So again, if someone's more active and fast paced, and yes, they're task orientated, or if they're more people orientated, and similarly, if they're more quiet and they're people orientated or task orientated, that then splits out into 4 very, very kind of general personality styles. And what that tends to mean is that you know, we will have our own preferences. We may have multiple preferences for the way that we operate, and our managers and the other people who work around us will have different preferences. And this can often be a source of miscommunication, misunderstanding, conflicting priorities, conflicting ways of doing things. And again, by understanding their style and your style and understanding where those friction points might be, it can help to develop a more harmonious relationship. And again, it's not about them kind of flexing their style to meet, or necessarily having to change who they are to meet you. And it's not about you changing your style to meet them, but it's recognizing that we both have requirements and needs in a working relationship. And by being understanding of those, we can probably get more from our working relationship. And what I tend to do when I'm working with teams or with managers or with individuals is to make them aware of this, and kind of get them to sit down and recognize these differences, and also then to kind of come up with ways that they can find to in some way mitigate them without compromising on their own values or styles and personalities. So that can be really useful as well. Just a couple more things to share with you, and then again we'll open this up into more of a kind of general conversation. Another source of challenge that I often find, not only with manager subordinate relationships, but also just in general, in life in general, but also in organizational life, is that there's a lack of clarity about what we're talking about, and a tendency to generalize. Now that can be from you giving feedback to your manager, or your manager giving feedback to you, or just raising things with each other. And I really like this sort of very simple framework, and I use this again in some of the training that I do with managers and teams, to help them to kind of get really clear about what they're talking about when they're talking about things that they want to do differently or change. And the way this works is that, you know, if there's something going on that we're not happy with, first of all, give the example, state what it is, be really crystal clear about it as much as possible, describe it in concrete language, rather than, you know, I'm just not happy with the way this relationship is working. Be clear about that. Give an example of when something's happened, or what you've observed in the kind of working relationship. Then the effect is to describe the effect that that's having, either the effect that it's had on you, the effect that it's having on your work, the effect that it's having on your team, or whatever. But again, that's to sort of describe the consequence of that, and then to describe what it is that you want to change or continue, and what you expect of the other person involved in this relationship. And it might sound like blindingly obvious, and well, yeah, tell me something I don't know, but actually it's so often the case that in these types of conversations that we're having with our managers, or when we're trying to raise an issue with them, we default back to, you know, it just seems that we're not communicating properly, and, you know, can we make that better? And without kind of some clarity about, well, what is the problem and what the effect that is having, and what specifically do you want me to do, it often leads to frustration and inaction, or in some cases, you know, kind of action, but the wrong action, because they don't really know what it is that's meant to be do, you know, what the problem is and how it needs to change. So that can be a really useful, simple way. And again, with all of these things, I think that, you know, having some sort of shared models that we use, or some shared frameworks that we have an agreement or a kind of psychological contract with our managers to use, can be really helpful, because it helps to kind of give some structure and some order to conversations and the communication that we have with each other. Just a sort of one, I had to say one more. I've got just one more after this. Some of you may be coaches, or you may have been coached, or you may have had coaching training, or you may have a manager who's trying to coach you. And again, I think in the spirit of what we're talking about today is it's entirely legitimate for you to coach your manager, to kind of to ask questions, to help them to understand what it is they're trying to do. And again, going back to that ABC model that I talked about earlier, to sort of try and unpick what it is they're trying to do, and how they're trying to do it, and help them to kind of maybe reflect on their own work and their own practice. For those of you who aren't familiar with coaching, this is a really, really simple coaching framework. It's called GROW, as you can see the acronym GROW. So the first thing is, goal. What are you trying to do? The second question is around, or questions are around reality. Where are you now? What's happening? In terms of what you're trying to achieve, and how well you think you're achieving it. And you can, in this case, you can use like a kind of scaling question, 1 to 5. If 1 is I'm not achieving it at all, 5 is I think I'm nailing it. Where are you on that scale? You can then ask questions about, well, what could we do to improve that? And then obviously, once you've got some options, get them to select one thing or 1 or 2 things that they're going to try and work on, that you've got a kind of common agreement with. Around. And I think it's entirely legitimate, for you to maybe not, kind of go in and say, right, I'm going to coach you, boss, but actually when a manager maybe sort of you can see them struggling with something, for you to intervene and maybe ask some of these questions that help them to kind of to find a solution. One of my experiences of being a manager myself is that it's a pretty lonely job. You tend to find that to get advice and support, your manager may be not managing you particularly well, and you're kind of operating in a bit of vacuum, and getting feedback is often quite difficult. And often managers just don't know how to do that. And actually, for you as someone who works for someone who's in that situation, to be able to sort of ask them some questions and help them and see that they're struggling, again, in a way that isn't kind of come across as being patronizing or condescending, can often be really appreciated, and actually can help you to improve the relationship as well. Just the final thing I'm going to share with you, and I'll shut up, and we can kind of open up to a few questions. A lot of you in the poll earlier indicated that 48% of you said that decision making was often a challenge. Excuse me. And understanding or inconsistent decision making, and it's kind of one of those things that managers are rarely trained on how to make decisions. And you can't, because you kind of think, well, if you've made it this far, you must know how to make decisions. But it kind of goes back to the first slide I showed you earlier, in terms of the Peter principle, and the fact that actually managers often are fumbling around in the dark, really, because all they've really got to work as a frame of reference is their own managers and what they've observed and picked up by being managed themselves. And actually having a kind of a understanding of which different types of decision making processes or methods that you can use in different situations is really important. This is by a guy called Peter Senge, and there's a QR code for you there. And again, don't scan it now, but if you're interested in finding out more about this, you can have a look at this. And this is a good conversation to have in a team or with your manager if you think that it's appropriate. And basically what it's saying is that, look, there are times where it's entirely appropriate to use all of these decision making styles as a manager. There's a time where telling people what your decision is legitimate. If it's an emergency and the building's on fire, you're not going to kind of sit everyone down, get a post-it notes out and flip chart and kind of have an idea generation session about what you should do. You're going to say, look, get out, leave all your stuff, get in the car park, and I'll bring the clipboard down, and we'll count how many people are here. That's entirely legitimate in that situation. However, in certain other situations, that isn't appropriate. Similarly, if you work your way through the continuum, sitting down and making a decision about kind of co-creating a decision is entirely appropriate when we're looking at something where the manager doesn't really know what the right answer is. The group's involvement in that decision is really important, because it's something you need their buy-in. That might be a really appropriate time to use that as a decision-making approach, and it wouldn't be appropriate to just tell them what your decision is. So I think one of the challenges is we need to recognize that there is a continuum of different decision-making styles. Being absolutely transparent about the way you're making a decision and the which style of decision making you've chosen, and being clear about that with your team when you're making a decision is really helpful and really important. But also for people who work for a manager who's maybe used the decision making style that we don't think is necessarily appropriate, is to maybe kind of educate them again in a non-patronizing way, is that in certain situations, do you not think we need to kind of get more involvement from other people in a decision-making process? And don't get me wrong, in some cases, it's often a function of time and speed of decision that's needed, which often drives people more towards the left-hand side of this continuum. But the decision-making quality also massively improves as we move down to the right-hand side of this, because as we all know, making decisions in a vacuum often leads to pretty poor results, as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So that is my my kind of number of kind of ideas and models and frameworks that I think are relevant. I should have probably said this at the beginning. These are just my ideas. This is based on my experience. Have the humility enough to know that there are other equally legitimate ways of looking at this situation, but this is the kind of wisdom according to my experience and some of the work that I do with clients as well. And I'm more than willing to kind of accept different ways of looking at this, and also other things. And there's so many other things I could have talked about with you, but in 15-20 minutes of just kind of explanation and ideas, then these are the ones I sort of teased out that I thought were most relevant. So I am going to move now to see if we've got any questions in the chat. Have we got any questions, or do we want to look at the questions that we generated earlier? Jeremy, have we had any questions so far, or?
There hasn't been any that have come directly to me. They might have some either come to you or to Danica. But if
no, that's fine.
That's fine. Go through the submitted.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, I mean, maybe I'll have a look through some of the questions that you've generated before this and that you put in, and I'll pick up on a few. I won't be able to cover all of them. And then what we're going to do, probably in about sort of 5 minutes, just 5 minutes of this, and then what I thought we'd do is put you into some breakouts, just to, as I said, I think it's equally important to get your own perspectives on this stuff. I often find when I do these sorts of workshops, whether it's training or sessions like this, you can learn as much from your peers who are kind of dealing with these kind of issues as you can from someone like me, who's kind of sort of sharing imparting my thoughts and wisdom. I'm just going to run through these questions now, just to sort of, I probably won't cover them all because I think we've covered some of them. But how to communicate, preferred style of being managed, I kind of covered that, but I think it is a really important thing to recognise, and it's also to recognise that it's a mutual thing. It's not just their problem. It's a shared responsibility to make that work, and recognising that that they have a different style to me, I have a different style to them. That doesn't mean mine's right, theirs is wrong. I think it's having that kind of humility to recognize that. Avoiding short-termism, managers who often move to the next opportunity. Yeah, I think that is often a function of organizational life at the moment. Organizations are moving at 500 miles an hour. Having the time to be able to take stock is very difficult. And again, I think it's difficult to catch a manager and sort of say, whoa, let's just slow down a little bit. That often doesn't come across well. But I think, again, it goes back to some of those coaching questions. I think often there's a lot of suboptimal decisions, rush decisions that often lead to lots of rework. It's easy to sort of say that looking from the outside in. But I think, again, it comes down to, again, I think that they are manageable traits, and short-termism is something that you can coach into someone, but again, it's a difficult cycle to break. Being new to team management, team leadership, how to best manage a relationship with a manager who holds a senior position and may struggle for time. Again, it's about negotiating the fact that you need time with them. I'm not sure on that where it says being new to team management or team leadership is you, or they are new to management or team leadership. But again, I think contact time with your manager is incredibly important but more and more often is difficult. So I think it's about contracting with them as to how much time you can legitimately expect with them, and explaining to them again, like I said earlier, about why that's important to you. Groundwork relationship with a new manager. Yeah, and I interesting comment there about COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of people probably haven't even seen their manager in the flesh up until recently. So again, you know, I would ask you to reflect on any relationship that you have with anybody. It's just because it's your manager doesn't necessarily mean that you have to see it indifferently. It's about getting to know them as a human being, you know, understand what their pain points are, what they're trying to do, what their ambitions are, what their hopes, dreams, aspirations are, and being able to have that conversation with you. Again, level of emotional maturity might mean that they're not they might not be responsive to that approach, but I think you've got to try, and I think you've got to try and form a relationship. Does age matter? That's an interesting one. It shouldn't. I absolutely should not. When I you know, in my younger days, I worked for managers who were older than me. I worked for managers who were younger than me. I think it's about mutual respect. It doesn't, someone who's older than you doesn't necessarily mean they're better than you or have more, you know, knowledge than you. And also, you being younger doesn't mean that you're, you know, kind of naive and wet behind the ears and inexperienced. I think it's like any form of discrimination. It shouldn't be an issue, but sadly it may be. But I don't think age should matter. And I would hope that maybe a manager who's got a few more grey hairs and a bit more wisdom might be more emotionally mature, but that's not always the case.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, about the age gap one, which is something that's cropped up, which I guess is how best do you think to communicate? I'd almost say like cultural differences, like obviously the way, if you're a manager who is, say, in their 50s, and the way that you've gone through your management experience will inevitably influence how you manage, and then somebody who might be in their 20s, who's come from a very different background, who has maybe very different experience with their education, has a very different approach to how they want to be managed, how they want to be talked to, and do you think there's a way to effectively communicate that so that they're all talking from the same page? Because I think sometimes, as you said, for a lot of this, is that it's communicating your expectations is not clear, and maybe that is age an impact on that, perhaps?
Yeah. No, I mean, in that situation, again, I think it's like any form of diversity, isn't it? You know, it's just it's another form of difference, and I think I would like to think that a competent manager who is older than someone who is younger. I mean, I've managed people who are, you know, half my age, and I value their freshness, their knowledge of things that I don't you know, understand or have the inclination or can't be bothered to understand. I value that, and I see that as a massive asset to my team. Similarly, I would hope that they would recognize that, or whilst they're kind of probably, you know, highly intelligent and more worldly wise about sort of more contemporary issues, that I might have something that I can impart upon them that's of value. And, you know, that for me would be the ideal situation. And if you can come to that, you know, kind of understanding that actually, you know, together we're in a much better position to deliver great results because of our complementary abilities. So I realize though that isn't always the case, and sometimes it falls into a sort of a dynamic that, you know, older, more senior, you know, seniority versus meritocracy type organizations, that can be an issue. So it's difficult to kind of, you know, kind of give a prescriptive answer to what you should do in that situation. But I think it's probably recognizing that, yes, I have a lot to offer that I may not feel that I'm getting a chance to offer, but also maybe my manager has some things that I can learn from them as well. And if we can kind of see this as a sort of symbiotic relationship, then for me, that's what we should be trying to strive for in that working relationship. But yeah, and I don't think that there shouldn't be any kind of deference. You know, I know this is down to my own personal probably values as well, that, you know, I've never been one for saying, you know, I've never been one who doesn't like to be challenged by anybody, whether I'm, you know, it's a subordinate, a manager, a team member, or even a kind of, you know, somebody who I'm hiring to do some work for me. I hire them for their ideas and not just their hands. So, but that's just my way of seeing the world, and I appreciate that, you know, in some relationships that might not be the case. But it's a, you know, it is a valid question. But I would challenge you to say, you know, how do you manage any other form of diversity in a working relationship? And to me, it shouldn't be any different to that. I don't know if that answers the question. I'm conscious, got loads more questions that we could potentially run through, but I think we'd probably good to just, like, for me to give you a break from my voice and just step away. And should we go into the breakout? So in the breakouts, I think there's no specific question that we've got. It's just a chance for you to say, you know, what are some of the things you're struggling with? Have we or I kind of covered them? Are there things that I've not talked about that you want to kind of maybe share with your kind of fellow alumni, or, you know, have I just been talking a lot of rot and you just sort of want to kind of pull it apart? I'm not precious, as I said. So let's give you, how long we got, Jeremy, just in terms of the agenda?
We've got about 15 minutes. So if we give them sort of 5, and we can tackle any questions that might come out of that, or any outstanding, or like maybe one major question from the pre-submit ones, and then we'll wrap up.
Absolutely, yeah. So 5 minutes, get into your groups, just try and give everybody a chance to sort of have a you know, kind of talk and just sort of share a few ideas. But you know, if you've got any questions, any comments, stick them into the chat so we can kind of address them when you come back. We've got everyone back.
We do, yes.
Have we got any questions, observations, thoughts? Anybody want to put something in the chat? Anybody want to unmute themselves and appear before us to kind of questions or alternative perspectives? Or have we kind of overwhelmed you?
It's a lot's taken over a Wednesday lunchtime. I
know. Oh, we got hands. Jules put a hand up. Jules, what is your...
I will.
Do you want to type something? Or hi, Joel.
Our group sort of centered around the debate about the differences between leadership and management, and they are quite nuanced, and that while some people felt the people can manage, that doesn't necessarily mean they can lead. But people also generally felt that if you aren't a good manager, you're probably not really a great leader. So that leadership and management training, once you've got people management responsibility, is you know, should be really mandatory, because some people get promoted into management positions because of longevity or a skill in a particular area, but that doesn't make them good people managers. And therefore, how do they set the vision? How do they get people to come, you know, change hearts and minds, get people to come on board with them, all that sort of stuff. So I think we were all fairly agreed in our assessment.
Thank you, Joel. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jeremy and I were just talking about that. I wrote a blog about this a while ago, and I can send the link via Jeremy, which was all around does getting promoted lower your emotional intelligence? Because there's research been done, there's kind of an inverse relationship between emotional intelligence and seniority within organisations, and you know, the premise behind that was, does it actually, as you rise up an organisation, do you actually become more emotionally sort of stupid, as it were, by kind of like losing touch with people and the relationships, and because you become more distant and more isolated from them? Or is it that organizations promote you based on, you know, your technical ability, as we said earlier, rather than your emotional intelligence, which kind of filters out those people you know, who are more empathetic and better with people, and therefore kind of the opposite rise to the top. And so I think it's, you know, kind of links to what you've been talking about there, which is, you know, the difference between leadership and management, which often get muddled, which is, you know, managers tend to create order and processes and systems. Leaders create visions and kind of values and kind of a sense of direction and motivation. And I would argue you need both of those to be a good leader or manager, whichever of those terms we want to use. You know, having a manager who's or someone who's managing you, who is high on leadership and low on management, often, they kind of create loads of kind of aspirational ideas, but they're kind of hopeless at implementing them. Someone who's the opposite is great on process and systems and all of that, but kind of just doesn't know how to relate to people. You need to have both in equal measure. And so I think, as we think about how we manage our managers, we need to think about ourselves and how rounded we are as well, because there's a leadership and a management element of influencing upwards as well, I think. So yeah, really good conclusions by your group, Jules. So thank you. Any other questions or anything? Conscious of time, we've got 3 minutes left.
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes left. Probably enough time for one more question or one more of the pre-submitted questions, and then we'll probably have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Yeah. In lieu of that, and we'll keep an eye on that. Jeremy and I were just talking very briefly about, what do you do in a situation where you've got a toxic manager? I kind of flippantly said earlier, get away from it, leave, run away. I think, in that situation where you've got someone who, and it is, and again, obviously, if it is bordering on, completely inappropriate behavior, then that's a conversation you need to have with the people who you can talk to about that. But where it's kind of lower level and less kind of not as obvious, but it's just, it's damaging your mental health, I think you have got to think in the long term as to how sustainable that is, and is there a way that you can distance yourself from it, either by an internal change of direction or kind of just getting out of there. But in the short term, I think you've got to kind of create some fire breaks between what's going on and how it's affecting you, and that you do need in those situations to basically be absolutely clear about what you're going to accept responsibility for and what you're going to burden, and how much of that you're going to recognize is what the things I'm being asked to do here are impossible. And I think in those sort of situations, it's definitely about finding someone you can talk to, who you can trust, obviously, and confidentially have a chat with to help you through that, because it's really difficult to kind of reconcile those situations on your own, because you're too in amongst it yourself. You're not sure whether it's you or them. Often those sorts of relationships do kind of lead you into kind of feeling as though you're to blame for some of these issues, and that obviously isn't fair. But I think you've got to recognize that is there some role that I'm playing in this that I could change, but also I think you've got to kind of create some sort of distance just between yourself, just for your own mental health. Anyway,
I was going to say, actually, that I think maybe that's a really good final takeaway point, which is, even if it's not a toxic relationship, having somebody who isn't necessarily emotionally invested in your management relationship to bounce ideas off of, because often if you're in a relationship where you feel like you're struggling, it's very easy to take everything personally, even when it's not necessarily meant that way. And so having somebody who's not connected, where you can have a vent and then go, okay, but have you thought about this? Or I can see where they're coming from. It really helps having that third party to reevaluate which bits are genuinely a problem as it may be from your manager, and which of it is, well, actually maybe it is me not communicating my needs clearly, or we're working with different communication styles and we're both just like passing ships in the night kind of a deal. So having that person's really useful.
Yeah, just use those grow questions that we shared earlier. Get someone to ask you those questions, because often it's articulating, it's vocalizing your problems, just uses a different part of the brain that when you're just thinking about it on your own, and that in and of itself can be really helpful. Even just reading the questions out and answering them, just to the screen can sometimes just help you make some connections you'd not already made. So yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. It is bang on 1:30. Thank you so much, Craig. It's been really, really interesting. I already know I've said it before, but I'm definitely going to go and read that Snakes book. I think that's going to be fascinating. Thank you so much for your insight, for your experiences. Next month's Develop session is focused on how volunteering and sort of extracurriculars can benefit your career. So if you're interested in that, please make sure that you sign up. And apart from that, thank you again, Craig. Thanks so much for giving up your time and expertise.
Pleasure.
Thanks everybody for attending for the afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We hope to see you soon. Good afternoon and goodbye.